Welcome to another Telltale Books video. I'm Greg, and I am going to continue my Alfred Bester series, which has only just started. A while ago, I did a review of his very first story, The Broken Axiom, and so I'm finally getting back to him to talk about his second story, titled No Help Wanted. No Help Wanted was published in Thrilling Wonder Stories in December 1939. And it's only a one-page story in Thrilling Wonder Stories. And I don't have a copy of that issue. I read it in a PDF I found online, which, by the way, I've been talking up those PDFs a lot in my videos. I saw a news article where, because of copyrighted material still in some of those magazines, even though the magazine itself is out of copyright, and a lot of the fiction in those old issues are out of copyright and public domain because nobody bothered to renew them. There are copyrighted stories in some of those magazines, and so there are people in the courts trying to get the sources of those PDFs shut down. So I guess search at your own risk. Do a search on the internet. You may come up with something, you may not. A lot of what I talk about that I'm reading in PDFs may soon go away from the internet and not be able to be had, which would be sad, because there is a lot of this stuff that is interesting, if not great, that if you only can get a hold of it by getting a hold of the original printed copy of the magazine, some of which sell for hundreds of dollars, others of which you might be able to pick it up at a reasonable price, but it's going to be in really sad shape and falling apart. And you're going to fear touching it for fear that it's going to crumble away. I mean, they're that bad. It would be nice if somebody would, especially since, well, you got to take it on a case by case basis. Like I say, some of the stories in those old magazines have been renewed and have been kept in print in anthologies or collections, but there's a lot of it that hasn't. And some of it maybe should go away because it's that bad, but some of it is interesting and should be kept alive. But if we take those PDFs away, you're not going to be able to get it anymore, except through a few small publishers that are reprinting these magazines in facsimile. There are some issues of Weird Tales you can get that way. There are a lot of issues of magazines like Planet Stories and Thrilling Wonder Stories that you can get that way. Uh, the publishers that are doing this have hardly scratched the surface of the pulp magazines that could be reprinted. So there's a lot that they don't have to offer, even though there are a lot of good issues that they do offer. So there's an issue here, that a lot of these stories are not going to see book publication ever again because they're just not of interest to today's audiences, except for those few of us that are fascinated by the early days of pulp magazines and science fiction especially. So how do we keep that alive? How do we keep it so that those people who are interested in that part of literature are able to access those stories? I mean, there's a lot of stuff like Manly Wade Wellman is a terrific author, but his early science fiction stories are not so good, so I don't foresee those being published in books. If they do get published in books, they're going to be um, limited edition collector's volumes selling for over $100 a pop. But I don't know what the end of this is. I do feel that when you go back a certain number of years, copyright becomes a restriction and a restraint that blocks those old works from ever being seen again. And if the copyright could be taken off, then people would have access to those works and be able to read them. There's got to be a middle ground there that we could strike up. That, I mean, public domain only goes right now, I think, is up to 1928, but that's only in the United States. 1928 or 1929, but that's only for the United States. For authors from other countries, that's not necessarily the case. So, and that's a long, long time ago. And there's a lot of fiction published between 1928 and I'd say 1960 in the science fiction magazines that just doesn't have any profitable opportunity in publishing books of it. So how do you resolve that? You know, it's going to be lost forever if we don't bring this stuff back and make it possible for fans to get hold of them without having to pay gobs and gobs of money. Got to be a middle ground to that where the estates of these authors, because none of these authors are alive anymore, there's got to be a middle ground where the estates of the authors can be satisfied and the fans can have access to this fiction without having to pay thousands of dollars to get it all. So, with that, anyway, No Help Wanted is one that where I don't have it in a book. I don't have a copy of Thrilling Wonder Stories physically. I found a PDF online. I believe it's still out there at this time. And so I was able to read it. No Help Wanted is flash fiction. A little bit about Bester, of course. If you're not familiar, Alfred Bester is the author of The Demolished Man and The Star's My Destination, which is also known as Tiger Tiger. A couple of very, very, very famous books in the science fiction genre. I believe one of those two, I forget which, won the Hugo Award for Best Novel. Let me look that up quick. I should have that here. Um, okay, The Demolished Man won the Hugo in 1953, which I believe was the inaugural year it won for Best Novel. And The Star's My Destination did not get either Hugo or Nebula, but is just an incredibly famous book by Alfred Bester. He's also written some very, very popular and much anthologized short stories like Adam and No Eve from 1941, Fondly Fahrenheit from 1954, The Men Who Murdered Muhammad from 1958. Bester, I haven't read a whole lot about him, but I did read one short article about him where he was described as having a kind of a conceited attitude, like he was the best writer in science fiction and everything else anybody else was doing was absolute garbage. I don't know. I think he got that because of books like The Demolished Man and Stars My Destination, which were kind of ahead of their time and are still very popular today and are touted as masterpieces in the genre. But everybody has their beginnings. And in 1939, Alfred Bester was like everybody else at that time, a fan who loved the genre and wanted to write, and he tried his hand at it, and his first couple of stories were nice, but nothing great. These weren't great literature. No Help Wanted was incredibly short. It is a piece of what today we would call flash fiction. In Astounding, they called these probability zero stories. And before the term flash fiction was coined, these were always called short stories. Frederick Brown was a master of the short story. No Help Wanted is an example of that. And I'll call it flash fiction because that's what people today are most familiar with, the term and what that entails. And can't really give you much of a synopsis without totally destroying the story for you. If you're interested, you should go read it. Uh, but the basic synopsis is there's this guy that wants to get a job working with astronomy, but he's told he doesn't know enough about astronomy after being asked some kind of basic questions and giving answers that the people he was talking to felt were wrong. Okay. Many of you can probably figure out where this is going from that being in a science fiction magazine. Um, so the ending was not, it was a surprise ending, but it wasn't that big of a surprise. It was kind of easy to see coming. But it wasn't a bad story for what it is and when it was written and how early in Besser's career it was, and the fact that it was in Thrilling Wonder Stories, which was not publishing the very best science fiction at that time. They published some really good stories, but a lot of what they published was still very much 1930s style space opera adventure and hadn't woken up to the change that Astounding was forcing the genre to go through. So it was in 1939, it was a market where in 1939 through like 1945, it was a market where the old guard of science fiction that didn't want to adapt to what Campbell wanted to do could still sell their stories. They just didn't make as much money. So that's No Help Wanted. Very short, not much to it. Interesting, but if you're not really interested in Alfred Bester and want to know where he came from, if you're not a Bester completist, you probably have no interest in reading this story. So, have you read No Help Wanted by any chance? If you have, leave your comments. Please don't spoil it. But tell me what you think. Do you think this is really good? Do you think it is a very, very amateur early work? Otherwise, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and keep coming back for more Alfred Bester, the next one of which is called Guinea Pig PhD, published 3 months later in March of 1940 in, this one is in Startling Stories, the companion magazine to Thrilling Wonder Stories. And I actually have that Startling Stories. I have a copy of that physical issue, so I don't have to read the PDF on that one. I hope you'll come back and join me.